Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike McShane. I'm a research fellow in education policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and it is my joy to play moderator today and allow the gentlemen sharing the stage with me to share their wisdom with you through years of hard-won experience. In some cases, experience, well, you know, y'all can be the judge of that one. But before we start, I do just want to offer a couple sort of framing comments about the discussion that we're having today, about weighing the very sort of difficult judgments that need to be made in balancing accountability and autonomy in private school choice programs, or in choice programs generally. But before we get started, the way this is going to work is each of our presenters are going to have a chance to say a few words. I'm going to moderate a discussion for a few minutes, and then we have microphones available here to allow you to participate in the conversation as well. Now, unfortunately, it never works out that everybody who would like to ask a question gets the opportunity to ask a question. But I noticed in your folders, we have these great little Twitter cheat sheets. All of us up here on the dais are on Twitter and others. So if you have questions that you're not able to ask to continue the conversation, feel free to tweet them at us. And at some point in the next couple days, we would definitely like to get back to you. So when we talk about the balance between autonomy and accountability in school choice programs, I think there are three things that we should keep in mind. It's something to think about as the conversation moves on today. The first thing is that things that are designed to do one thing are not often good at doing something else. So what I mean by that is that the accountability systems that we have created to regulate our traditional public school system work within a particular context. So I think the general logic behind them, which is correct, is to say that in many cases, students are required to attend a certain public school. They don't have a lot of choice in the matter, so we need to do everything that we can to ensure that that is a quality option for them. So we've developed the sort of test-based accountability systems to try and ensure that students have a high-quality option there. But school choice programs work under a different logic, right? Families are able to choose between their different schools. So adding the pressure of the marketplace in addition to all of those changes the conditions on the ground. So it's important for us to think as we think today, what does this new regulatory system look like that takes into effect that we are regulating a vibrant marketplace of school options? The second thing to always keep in mind is that regulations have costs. Right? So the more things that we ask of schools, the more things that schools have to do. One of the great things about school choice is it encourages small organizations, religious organizations, community organizations, mom and pop operations to get in on the act of educating children in their communities. But the more and more that we stack regulations, hoops, and hurdles on them, the more difficult their lives become. And there's a real fear of crowding out smaller providers, which I don't think is something that any of us want to do. And finally, I think it is important to note that many families in polling that's done by a variety of organizations will tell you that one of the reasons that they are leaving traditional public school systems is to get away from standardized testing, to get away from what they think is a prescribed scope and sequence of curriculum. So they see school choice as this great opportunity to get away from all of that. So I think it's important to keep those things in mind as we discuss today. But with that, I'll shut up. And kick it over to our presenters here. So I'm going to introduce all three of them first, and then we'll just head on down the line and allow them to make their comments. So first off, we have Scott Jensen, who is a senior strategist for the advancement of school choice at the American Federation of Children. Previously, he served 14 years in the Wisconsin Assembly, including 3 terms as Assembly Speaker. He also served as Chief of Staff to Wisconsin Governor Tommy Thompson, and played a crucial role in the creation, expansion, and defense of Milwaukee's pioneering school choice program. Next to him, we have Adam Peshek, who's the State Policy Director for School Choice for the Foundation for Excellence in Education, our host here. Previously, he was Legislative Director for the Foundation for Florida's Future and a Research Associate at the Reason Foundation. And batting cleanup, we have Doug Tuthill, who's currently the president of Step Up for Students, a nonprofit Florida organization that provides over 68,000 low-income students with scholarships to attend qualified private schools. He started his career as a teacher in 1977 and has been the president of 2 local Florida teachers unions and represented teachers on the state commission that created the Sunshine State Standards and the FCAT test. So without further ado, Scott, take it away.
Thank you and good morning. So I first started wrestling with this question about the right mix of accountability and autonomy 25 years ago when I was the kid chief of staff to Tommy Thompson, the governor of Wisconsin, who along with Polly Williams created the first modern private school choice program. And our original view 25 years ago was that, well, we really don't need much regulation on this program. We just need to give people lots of options and then let the market do its magic. We learned pretty quickly that it's hard to create a well-functioning marketplace overnight in a system in which most of the consumers had never had any choice in the product. Creating that overnight was something that was problematic. And so in the first few years, we had a couple of stories that came out about the way money was spent or the way some of the schools were run that haunted us really for decades in Wisconsin. And so legislators do what legislators do, regulators do what regulators do, and each of them began to, over the course of the last 25 years, come up with different ways to try to bring accountability to the program. You had the Republican style, you had the Democratic style, you had the bureaucratic style, you had the split government style, which usually results in really bad compromises. And over time, the Wisconsin program became the most regulated school choice program in the country. It did not become the most accountable program in the country. It became the most regulated. And we recognized that. And so about 10 years ago, the Alliance for School Choice and the American Federation for Children began working with our allies, many of them who are here in the room, to try to develop model legislation for people, to try to give states some idea of the right way to do this. And we recognized that a completely unregulated model had created these stories in places like Wisconsin and Florida that really just haunted us and made it very hard for us to go out and expand the programs. The same anecdotes got used year after year after year. I remember it was just 4 or 5 years ago in Wisconsin, hearing stories from 20 years ago in legislative testimony. I mean, that school was gone, that problem was disappeared 20 years ago, we fixed it, and they're still bringing those up as a way to move forward. So we decided that we needed to focus on creating accountability in a number of areas. And if we could turn the PowerPoint presentation on, the first one, that would be great. We decided that there were 3 areas in which we needed to enforce accountability. And those were in the administrative accountability in an effort to ensure safety and transparency, financial accountability to make sure that funds were spent appropriately and that schools didn't collapse and close partway through the school year, and academic accountability to make sure that students were learning, which was the goal of the program from the start. So our model legislation really kind of took the same fashion that we used in America's highly competitive financial markets. The idea was that we would ask for standardized measures of performance that are publicly reported by all of the providers so that consumers can choose the one that's best for them. So standardized measures of performance, all publicly reported, and then let the consumers choose which investment, which school was right for their family. Now, in my remarks today, I'm going to highlight the regulations that we have recommended or the accountability work that we've recommended for voucher schools, but you have a handout that was handed to you that has them not only for voucher programs across the country, but scholarship tax credit programs and ESA programs. The voucher programs, because it is public funds that are following the student to the school of choice, tend to be the most regulated, and there's the greatest state interest in that regulation. In scholarship tax credit programs, they tend to be more lightly regulated, the concept being that the scholarships are created as a result of private donations, and therefore less public interest in regulating some of that. And in the case of the ESA programs, you know, there's 2. We're still refining them. It's an idea that's in progress, and we're still trying to develop the appropriate accountability mechanisms for a program that gives parents much more freedom than the other 2 versions of school choice that we're seeing. So let's go to administrative accountability. The goal here on administrative accountability is, first of all, to make sure the kids are safe and that the parents and the public know which schools are participating in the programs, you know, what sort of things that they're providing. So these regulations tend to be very basic. They're things like health and safety, background checks to make sure everybody's safe, non-discrimination clauses, and just basic registering and reporting who's participating in these programs. In most cases, this is a very light level of regulation, not very burdensome on the schools. It's just focusing on transparency and safety. In the case of financial accountability, there's really 2 things that we're trying to accomplish here. First is to make sure that funds are spent appropriately, And so in the accountability there, quite often we're either recommending an audit be done of how the schools are spending the funds that are being given to them, or some other financial information report which demonstrates that the money that they received in vouchers then was used to educate children, not for some other unintended purpose. The second goal is financial viability. We've had problems in some of the early programs where schools would collapse in November, and then the state would now have to pay to educate those kids at another place. So the state would have paid twice. So in this case, we're looking for a financial guarantee of some sort that the school will survive, and that if necessary, they can pay the scholarships or the vouchers back to the public in case the kids have to transfer to another school. Again, most of this is not very heavy regulation, and we've found that financial regulation tends to be a pretty good proxy for how well the schools are doing. A school that is whose finances are a mess is probably not well run and is probably not doing a particularly good job educating children. And so it's something of a proxy for how well the school is run. The most difficult area and the hardest to achieve any agreement on is been in the area of academic accountability. And our big goal here has been to resist the temptation that Governor Bush talked about earlier to regulate based upon the inputs. You know, the public sector regulates its education programs all based upon inputs. And we don't want to be out there suggesting that we're regulating based upon credentials or that we're time in seat or the curriculum of the program. We want to avoid all those things. We want to be focused on outcomes. What is the performance that's being provided here at these schools? So I think we judged that one thing that was appropriate was testing. And in the first wave of these efforts, we said that every child who was in a voucher program or a school choice program should have to take either the state test or a nationally normed reference test. The test would be chosen by the private school. They don't have to change their curriculum or change the testing they have. Take the test that they have and report that to the parents. Informed parents, we believe, would be the best way to have accountability academically in these programs. Unfortunately, it isn't too much of a surprise that politicians said, well, that's great that the parents know how the kids are doing, but we're spending an awful lot of the public treasury on these programs. It'd be nice for us to know how those kids are doing. So in the second wave of these programs, the second wave of these academic accountability efforts, we said that they should have either a state or national test that would be reported to both the parents and to some sort of independent analysts. So in Washington, Wisconsin, and Florida, large studies were done to see how children were doing in these programs. And that provided some feedback to policymakers with regards to how well these kids were doing. But that was a snapshot test. We were finding out how the kids were doing in their third grade reading test. Not necessarily had they learned a year's worth of materials in a year's worth in the classroom. It was a snapshot of what the achievement level is. And it's problematic in some of these programs because if you're a private school that is taking a kid from a failing public school, they probably come to you a couple of grades behind. And so now that first snapshot is going to show that the kid is a couple of grades behind, and as happened in Wisconsin, the opponents and the Department of Public Instruction blamed the private school, who had only had the kid for 6 weeks, for the fact that they were 2 grades behind. Not the public school that they had come from, but the new private school that was trying to change their lives. The second thing we found with just sort of these snapshot tests is that an academic test isn't necessarily the only measure that we should have out there. You should be looking at not just achievement, but also attainment. When you go out and apply for a job, they never ask you how you did in the third grade reading exam, right? They don't ask that question. They ask, did you graduate from high school? Did you go on to college? Did you get a degree in college? Those are the questions you get when you're going out into the real world. So we are now recommending to states that people who are working in these programs use a growth measure on academic achievement. Is the child learning more than a year's worth of material in the year that they spent at the school? Have they moved up since since second grade to third grade? Are they doing better than they were in the public school previously? And then also looking at attainment. Start measuring graduation rates, college acceptance rates, and college graduation rates. If you take a look at the handout that you have there, it has little circles colored in like a test that shows how each of the states are doing in these different types of accountability measures and how many of our model legislation items they have picked up. If you take a look in the administrative accountability area, again, it was very simple. 87% of the programs in the country use our model standards for administrative accountability. Less so in the financial accountability area, though most of the new programs have taken us up on this. And then less still in the academic accountability area. We need, obviously, to make improvements in financial accountability and academic accountability, but we also have to make sure that we don't lose autonomy at these private schools. Now, our model legislation has this wonderful provision, and it says that the state can't regulate this private schools any further than necessary to achieve the goals of this particular legislation, but we all know that regulators will push, that legislators will push, and the only defense against that is constant vigilance, as it always is against an encroaching government. That's the only way we can do it. Now, thankfully, we are 25 years into this, and we really don't have any examples of state governments trying to regulate the curriculum at private schools. So that is sort of the barrier that we cannot let the government get past, and thankfully we've gotten there. Now, I'm going to wrap it up here with just talking about a new debate that's beginning to emerge, and that is whether or not we need to have some consequences for poor performance or rewards for good performance beyond those that are created by the marketplace itself. It's a natural reaction from politicians to want to continue to regulate. Also, a lot of parents choose schools for reasons other than academic performance. They might choose a school because it is safe. That's a reasonable thing for a parent to do. They might choose a school because it's next to their sister's house, and she can watch the kids after school, again, worried about safety. So parents don't necessarily always pick the school that they think is necessarily going to be the best academically. And so the politicians are wondering, gee, maybe we need to nudge them towards selecting from a list of high-quality schools. And so some states have begun to develop consequences for poor performance, most notably Louisiana and Indiana, which both have agreed that when the schools are going to be measured and graded for how well they're doing, that failing schools will not be able to continue to enroll students in those schools until they get themselves off the failing list. I think that's a big debate that the school choice movement is going to have, whether that non-market academic regulation is appropriate or not, and it's one that states are beginning to explore. So that's kind of where we are in the debate today. We've got people out there trying to do amazing things. We'll see if they're able to do it. In Wisconsin, we are trying to create a single academic accountability system that works for traditional public schools, charter schools, and private schools. And some of the legislators who are working on this are in the audience. That is one big goal, given that they have completely different governance mechanisms, completely different cultures, and different responsibilities. But we are trying to create one academic accountability system for all publicly funded students. Thank you.
So, agree with all of what Scott said. I'm Adam Peshek with the Foundation for Excellence in Education, and we've been thinking about this a lot over the past year or so at least, and longer in general, but really trying to come up with a firm conclusion of where we are on this. So I'm going to talk mostly and delve into the idea of testing and what kind of tests should be used. Most of you a lot of you were squirming in your seats when this topic came up. The other things are kind of a little more common sense. We want to make sure funds are being used correctly. We want to make sure that kids are safe. When it comes to academic accountability, there's a huge divergence in opinions in the school choice movement. And it's really an interesting topic to talk about because unlike other education reform topics where there's a lot of outside pressures from unions or whatever, this is really kind of an internal debate that we're having among the education community about, how are we going to hold schools accountable for education, for their how they teach students, and if we should at all. And it seems like every year around January, there's a little bit of a battle royale within the education reform community where everyone decides to start blogging on this issue. So in preparing for this, I just went through in the past year to figure out, who's been writing about this. And here's about 100 pages of blogs from about 10 people, some who are in this room, talking about this single issue. And so I would kind of describe it as this. 20 policy wonks enter, and all 20 leave thinking they won the debate.
Is that the Tennessee legislature?
Yeah.
I noticed several people there.
Yeah. So very little consensus has been made around this. So the disagreement, in my opinion, comes from the simple fact that education reform has been very successful. Mike Petrilli from the Forum Institute has described 2 tracks of education reform that's happened over the past couple decades. There's been the school choice track, and there's been kind of the school accountability and standards track, where you want to make sure there's transparency in public education, make sure students are learning. And both of these tracks have been very successful. And most of the time in these states, the people in the state houses, governor's mansions, state policy organizations, they're the supporters of both of these tracks. So over the past couple of decades, it's just kind of been kind of natural that you'll have a legislator who says, okay, I support our state tests. I think that it's doing good things for our education system. I think that it's helping kids in the public schools learn. So why wouldn't I want kids in voucher schools to be using this test? And so it's a reasonable question. It's not an unreasonable thing, so that's why there's a lot of debate. I think that if you look at the states here, now this is a map that I just did of all the red states are states with active school choice programs. And here is a map of the bright red are states that require testing, and then the paler states are the ones that don't really require testing so much. So which one does the foundation fall on? It's a little bit of both, actually. So the dark red states, the maroon states, are states that require testing but allow the schools to choose between a state test or a norm reference test. And so why is that a distinction? A little 101. So state tests are what are called criterion reference tests, and they are tied to the state standards. So they very much are aligned with the goals that the state has set, and they guide the curriculum, and they decide how schools are going to pick the curriculum they choose, and so forth. So the reason we like norm reference tests a little bit more is that it gives a wider option for schools to choose from. I would be willing to bet, I haven't done the research, but probably 90% of private schools are already issuing norm reference tests. This isn't a huge burden on these schools, and quite frankly, I don't know how I would feel about a school that wasn't using some sort of a nationally normed reference test to show how students were doing. And unlike that, the state tests, it doesn't really limit them to one type of curriculum. Now, if they want to use the state test at a private school, I can completely envision a scenario where a private school says, we're going to take this state test, and we're going to market ourselves as being able to, kick the tail of the public school down the road. That's totally fine. But to require them to do one or the other, we would much rather have them be able to choose from a whole suite of options. So now, why do we prefer this approach? So first, the goal here is to provide information on student learning, which can be achieved through a norm reference national test. So Stanford Achievement, Iowa Test of Basic Skills, Terra Nova, so forth. Doug will talk a little bit more about how these are being used in Florida and the success that they're showing, but in general, they show information about how students are doing, which is the goal, so very simple. Second, it allows private schools to maintain their autonomy, which is what we're talking about here. Remember, these are not voucher schools or tax credit schools. These are private schools that most likely existed before the program, and if the program ran away, they would exist after. And they have their own way of doing things, and they are around because they are doing something that parents want. It's almost kind of shocking to think about private schools existing in our education system, since there's a 100% free alternative right down the road. But they're doing something. So Milton Friedman had an analogy where he talked about hot dog carts, where if the government decided to put up a hot dog cart on every corner in the country, what would that do to the hot dog carts you see here in DC? Well, the vast majority of them would go out of business. But the ones that stuck around would do something that was so innovative and so needed that they would stick around, and that those were the ones that are existing now in private schools. I mean, the fact that we have private schools is a sign that there's a need out there that's not being filled in public schools. So we want to make sure that they can do that and continue doing that. Third, and this is something that's not talked about as often, is we don't want to stifle innovation. So a lot of people at this summit, including me, are interested in kind of next generation reforms like competency-based learning. How do we move away from seat time requirements where an 8th grader is in 8th grade and he learns 8th grade curriculum for that year, and even if he's finishes it and masters it within half the year, he's got to stick there and hang out for the rest of the time. So being able to move to a customized education plan where kids can move on when they're ready, those kind of things are going to need different ways of doing things. So one state test is not going to be able to keep up with the innovation that's out there on these things, education savings accounts, where we're trying to break down education into segments. So not just school A or school B, but we'll have some school here, some school there. We'll do some school at home, some school online, to really break down. And that's a lot harder to do when you have one test that requires you to do the same thing at the end of the year. So fourth, and this is the one that I think a lot of people in the room are worried about. I think that this approach, as Scott said, has a lot less ability to be captured by regulatory overreach, the slippery slope argument that if we're requiring them to take this one test, what's next? And a lot of people kind of scoff at this argument, but as Scott said, it's kind of playing out in a lot of states. So we have one state that is deciding that they're going to, since the private schools in the voucher program are required to take the state test, and kids in the public schools, if they're not showing improvement by the end of third grade in reading, that they have to be automatically retained. Now that's a policy we support in the public schools, but we would draw a line to say that we don't want to see the state test being used to guide private schools and how they're choosing to operate their schools, whether it's retaining students, whether it's deciding how to advance students or how to deal with teachers. We want to make sure that those things are still private decisions that are being done by private schools. And also another problem you get into is that the state test and the accountability mechanisms that are tied to it are often, there's some nuances there that if you didn't think about could actually hurt your voucher program. So there's a state, for example, that requires voucher programs to be part of the national or the state A through F school grades. We support A through F school grades for public schools. But by making the public schools do it, this state, for whatever reason, has decided they're not going to look at learning gains. They're only going to look at proficiency of schools, public and private. Now, this is a voucher program that is designed for low-income students and failing schools, and they're being asked to take a state test and be measured as to whether or not they're meeting proficiency. So if you think about it, the low-income students and failing schools are going to be a huge disadvantage off the bat, and to be evaluating these schools on whether or not they're meeting grade level without talking about whether or not that student's making gains over a year. Those schools that are showing that they're not making proficiency might have had students that were making 3 years of learning gains in 1 year, but that doesn't show on the test. So there's kind of these unintended consequences that you get into where these schools are kind of held to a system that the public schools are much better at being able to control and figure out and kind of guide without having to force that onto private schools. And also, Mike brought this up, and it's a good point. When you're talking about regulation, you want to make sure that you're getting what you need, but you want to make sure that you're not doing it to crowd out other people. So there is a problem with bad schools, and we need to get rid of bad schools. But I think an equally bad problem is that we don't have enough good schools, right? So when you're focusing all of your regulation on whether or not people are meeting a certain bar, you're going to crowd out people who might be really good schools, but they see this red tape, they see this regulation, they see this fact that they have to take the state test, and they decide that they're not going to take part in this program. And I think that that's a key distinction. There's regulations that keep bad people out, but we need to make sure that it's not keeping out good schools too. And lastly, clearly why this is a good approach, in my opinion, is that it's creating choices, and that's the point of a school choice program. If a parent wants someone to take the state curriculum, there's plenty of options out there, whether it's the public school, most charter schools in most states. But this is something that we're trying to provide a choice that parents want. And the Friedman Foundation has done some work on what parents want out of education. And testing's on there. But the things that, when they polled, I think it was Georgia, tax credit parents, what they wanted, why they chose their school, the top answers were, student safety, that the environment, the culture of the school gave them something that their child came home with and they were proud of and they saw them growing. Student safety, more personal attention. So these are all things that can't be captured within this kind of a system that are best subjective decisions made by parents who are exercising choices. And there's been a growing number of studies that show all the things that are non-cognitive skills, like determination, perseverance, that have been shown to be very well grown in these programs that you can't measure, but are the key reasons why parents are choosing these schools. So just a couple closing thoughts. each state's different and each program's different, so be wary of people that say they have a one-size-fits-all solution for all school programs. You know, a tax credit program for students in failing schools will probably have a much different accountability mechanism than a voucher program for students with severe disabilities. And that's common sense. So if someone comes to you and says, here's the packet of things that you need to do to hold schools accountable in your state, be wary of that. And second of all, we need to remember when we're doing this that the goal is to create more, not create more of the same, but to create more options for parents. So when you're pursuing regulations, think about what that one red tape is going to do. Is it going to produce more choices for parents, or is it going to kind of limit to the things that they can do? So that should kind of be the guiding principle when you're thinking about these things. But I'll turn it over to Doug to talk more about what's happening in Florida. But that's kind of where we come out in the foundation. You know, transparency, ability to choose the test that suits your school, and not dictating too much from above what that test and curriculum looks like.
Great. Thanks, Adam.
Good morning. So I get to go last, and that means that they took all my best stuff, so I apologize for that. Because I'm the state guy, so they always start big picture, here's the national scene, and they get down to the state guy, and so I'm going to be repetitive, but I'll try to repeat the good stuff. I'm President of Step Up for Students. You met one of our superstars this morning, Denisha Merriweather, who, by the way, I offered a job to in 11th grade. And she said, as soon as I'm out of school, Doug, you know, we're good to go. Well, now she's told me she's going to her doctorate, so it's been, it's going to be like 9-10 years. But nonetheless, I've been wooing her for a long time, so
She's worth the wait.
someday I'm going to get that woman. She is phenomenal. Just as an aside, when she was in 11th grade, she emceed a rally at the Capitol for us with 6,000 people. As an 11th grade kid, she handled that brilliantly, and so that was the day I offered her a job. So I want to talk about this from the bottom up, because at Step Up, we run some programs on a day-to-day basis, and so we're constantly working with schools and parents and kids. And a lot of what I want to talk about is what we've learned from those day-to-day interactions. As you've heard, we've got about 69,000 kids today on our tax credit scholarship program. There's a low-income kids, average family for about $24,500 a year. We also have a new program, which Scott just mentioned earlier, which is it's called the Personal Learning Scholarship Account. It's really an educational savings account, and it's had a huge impact on our thinking because we're convinced that the ESA model is the future of how public education is going to be spending its money in the future. And so that's influencing how we're thinking about these accountability issues. And Scott said it's new for us, but we're sort of on the surfing the cutting edge of the revolution of how do you really begin to finish the run on customization. So real quickly, the way the PLSA works is right now the program is for special ed kids. We have 8 categories of special needs. If family qualifies, let's say autism, they get $10,000 into an account, and they can spend on that account throughout the year. And they spend it on a variety of things. Autism kid, for example, some of it may be school, but some of it's occupational therapy, physical therapy, horse therapy. My staff tells me if you met one autistic kid, you met one autistic kid. And so, you know, you got to think way outside the lines about what accountability means in that kind of environment. And in particular, what accountability means when parents are finally spending the money as opposed to the government spending the money. And as all my colleagues have said, when you think about accountability, it really sits on 2 pillars. It's consumer choice and government regulation. Unfortunately, because district schools historically have had very little choice, when you think about accountability, almost everybody thinks it's synonymous with regulation. That's not true. And so we got to make sure that as debate happens in our state capitals around the country, we constantly remind people that we're trying to find the right balance between consumer choice and regulation. Real quick story to sort of a metaphor to sort of put this in your brain. When I was a kid growing up, there was only one phone company. You know, so there was only one rate for local calls or one rate for long-distance calls. They actually even owned the phones in our house. There was very little consumer choice. So the phone industry was incredibly regulated because there was no choice. Today, there's a lot of choice. You can own all these different plans, et cetera. So as a result, the regulation is way less because the consumer choice is way more. That happens in every industry. And so what we're doing now is we're going through this major transformation from a 19th century public education system, which was a one-size-fits-all assembly line model, which we took from manufacturing in the 19th century, and now we're moving into a 21st century model that's all about customization. Well, customization involves enormous amount of choice. So now we're grappling with this change, and we've got to figure out how to get this balance, which, by the way, we'll constantly be grappling with. But the point is that at the grassroots level, that's what we're seeing, is trying to figure out how do we protect the public good in ways that we've been talking about. You know, is the money being spent appropriately? Are the kids' needs being met, et cetera? But again, if you've met one autistic kid, you met one autistic kid. So what's it mean for me to know that child's needs are being met? You know, it really becomes really complex. And so as we move into the 21st century, as we grapple with every child having a personal learning plan, everything about customization, we're going to be constantly battling with how do we find this balance. We believe in valid, reliable assessment. You know, it's impossible to move forward without knowing how the children are doing, and we believe that assessment ought to inform teaching and learning. But as my colleague said, as we move away from one size fits all, when parents make choices and schools make choices, we got to give them choices in order to have the flexibility to meet their particular needs. So in Florida, we're convinced that testing requirements should be in place, but we ought to have options. And so what we do in Florida is we give schools in our task credit program a list of approved testing, norm reference tests that they can use. And most of them take the Stanford 10, as Adam mentioned. Some of them use Iowa Basic, some of them use Terra Nova, but they all have options in terms of what they choose. Now, from a policy perspective, you might ask yourself, is this really meeting your needs? Is this really giving the public what they need? So I want to show you a little bit about how it's working in Florida. From a policy perspective, think about if you got all this as a governor or a state legislator, would this be enough to make you think like, okay, I find the right balance between testing, but not too much micromanagement, not too much overregulation? So here are our requirements. Every child in 3rd through 10th grade has to take a nationally normed standardized test. The test had to be approved by the State Department of Education. Most take the Stanford 10, and then we send the test to independent researchers who do a bunch of cooking of the data. So every year we get a report that says how the kids are doing versus all kids nationally. We also get a report about how they're doing versus control group in the district schools, and we get lots of other data which I'm going to share with you. For example, one of the things the researchers tell us is who the kids are. I mentioned that these are low-income kids. Average family of 4 is about $24,500 a year. It's based on the Federal Free Reduced Lunch Program. We also find that the students who come to us are the lowest performing kids in the district schools. And most of them are minority kids. About 85% of our kids are Black, Hispanic, or some combination thereof. So what have we learned over the years? You know, is this enough to give you what you need as a policy person? First of all, as I said before, because we test every year, we know that these kids are the lowest performing kids in the state, and they're also the highest poverty kids that are coming to us. And in the bottom there is a quote straight from the report that comes out every year summarizing this particular theme. Second, we know that the kids, because they're taking a nationally normed standardized test, we know that they keep up every year with all kids nationally. Now, you guys all know that this is a tremendous achievement because in most cases, every year that a low-income child is in school, they fall farther and farther behind. So the fact that we're taking the lowest performing kids in the state who've had sort of the Denisha experience, I mean, they've had their hope crushed, right? They've just been struggling and struggling and struggling. They're unmotivated. Nobody likes to fail all the time. They come into our program, and now, for the first time, they're getting a year's worth of growth in a year's worth of time. And so we're not completely satisfied because they come in oftentimes several years behind, and 1 year's worth of growth in 1 year is not enough. We're going to have to get 1.5 to 2, but nonetheless, you know, we're making progress. Third, not only are the kids doing well in the program, but the researchers have also found, looking at the testing data, that the kids in the district schools also benefit. And there are two major reasons. One is the competition effect. So in zip codes where we're taking a lot of kids out, there's some zip codes in the Orlando area, for example, we're taking almost 1,000 kids out of the local elementary and middle schools. That's a lot of competition for those kids. So that competition is forcing the district schools to get really innovative and really reach out and no longer see low-income kids as a pain in the rear, but now look at them as an asset, and how do I recruit those assets? The second thing is, remember, I'm recruiting the highest poverty, lowest performing kids in the state. If you take 1,000 high-poverty, low-performing kids out of a small number of schools, what's going to happen in those schools? You're lowering the poverty rate. You're lowering the number of kids who are struggling. It makes it easier to take the resources you have and do a better job with the kids who are still in the school. So, by the way, just as an aside, we also save the state money because for every kid that goes on a scholarship, it costs the state about 50 cents on the dollar. So I'm saving the state 50 cents on the dollar for every kid that comes into my program. I'm taking kids who are the most lowest performing, and they're now getting a year's worth of growth and a year's worth of time, and I'm also improving the academic achievement in district schools. What's not to love, right? Come on. And I'm being sued, by the way, by school boards and state teachers unions who are doing everything they possibly can to shut down the program. That's the kind of love I get. So, what if we were to require all the kids in our program to take the state test? A couple things. I've got, this is a year ago from last year's data. So last year we had about 60,000 kids in the program attending about 1,400 schools around the state. We only make up about 1/4 of the enrollment in the private schools that the kids attend. So about 3/4 of the kids are private pay on average. Most of the schools do prefer a nationally normed test, and some of my colleagues have mentioned that when people pay to go to a school, they have a little bit of influence over the school's decisions. And so most of the paying customers want a nationally normed test. They want to know how their children are doing against all kids nationally. Because these are kids that oftentimes are going to be looking to competitive colleges, so they're really looking at a national picture. And so mandating that the local private school that only has 1/4 of their kids on a tax credit scholarship program has to give the state test to all the kids creates all these problems. You have to test one set of kids with the state test, another set of kids with the national norm test. That gets a different kind of teaching. I mean, it's a mess. So we really think, from a policy perspective, it does not make any sense to mandate that everybody has to take the criterion reference state test, that it ought to be an option to take the norm reference national test, that researchers can do some comparisons that inform you as policymakers, and it does allow families to have real choice in ways that empowers them and allows them to make difference in their children's lives. I guess, in closing, what I also think is exciting is, as we move into the era of customization, technology is going to revolutionize how we think about assessment. So in many ways, this is an old paradigm discussion. But right now we're all living in the old paradigm world in our legislators anyway, so that's cool to have that discussion. But we know that in the future, assessment is going to be merged with teaching and learning. And you can do valid and reliable assessments. That's an ongoing process. It's not a one-time-a-year event anymore that's a paper and pencil thing. In the future, we'll be able to collect data continuously that continuously informs teaching and learning, but it's valid and reliable. In the old days, we couldn't do that because the teachers' assessments were not valid and reliable. That's why we have once-a-year standardized testing. But with technology, that problem goes away. And that begins to revolutionize this whole issue. And so that's another something to think about is, as we move from testing as an event to state testing as a continuous process that continuously informs teaching and learning, it reshuffles the whole deck. And I think that's part of the interesting discussion you ought to be having in your state legislatures. Just don't think about this policy issue in terms of looking at the rearview mirror, but what's happening in the future is going to redefine the whole debate. And I think we have some very exciting opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Great. So I'm going to start by asking a couple questions, and then we're going to kick it over to the audience. So one thing that I was hoping to do with the panel here is try and get an understanding of sort of where we agree and where we disagree, perhaps, and why. Because it sounded to me throughout your presentations that there was pretty strong agreement that testing is useful to give parents information. So if we're going to have a functioning marketplace, parents need to have information on the options that they're choosing. I'm seeing heads nodding. No one is we're all on that one. Okay, outstanding. Now, where I worry, or where it seems like there might have been some disagreement, is a second function of testing, which is accountability, which is how do we hold schools accountable for the academic performance of their students? And it seemed at different times folks were saying that that might not need to happen, that a state or district or whomever would hold schools accountable, private schools or schools participating in choice programs, based on the performance of their students on tests. Is that something that all of you share? Should, even from this bundle of tests, so if students take a nationally normed reference test, if they take the state criterion reference test, if a school performed behind some definition that you might have below where you think they should be, does the state have an obligation to step in and do something about it?
No. And I'll tell you why. We can shut down schools for financial and administrative reasons. And as Scott said, there's a high correlation between financial effectiveness and academic effectiveness. It's like 90-some% when in the real world. I'm really nervous about coming in and shutting down schools based on some sort of academic standard. First of all, I spend a lot of time in low-income communities. There's not enough choice in low-income communities. So for example, I have a very low-performing charter school in my community that just got shut down by the school board. They were delighted to shut it down. But what's interesting is, while that was a low-performing charter school, the zone schools that those kids were pushed back to are even more low-performing. And so the problem for a lot of low-income communities, for example, is they don't have enough choice already. And if you start shutting down schools because a bunch of smart white people think that, I'm helping these people by shutting down the low-performing schools, that's not necessarily the reality, in a lot of people's lives. The other thing I've been telling our staff is, what's the future business potential of Step Up for Students? I'm convinced that part of the future of our organization is making sure that we work with parents to help them have the information they need to know how their children are performing, but also how to make good choices in the future. As you move into the world of customization, and we have this huge portfolio of options for families, it's daunting in terms of how to make those choices. And we know that markets work best when consumers are making really effective choices. So I think in the long run, and even the short run, we got to put huge investments in helping people make better choices, and dealing with sort of the academic or the administrative and financial stuff. But right now, in the history of where we are right now, I think it's a mistake to start shutting down schools based on some arbitrary definition of low performing, because I think we may inadvertently do way more harm than good.
Yeah, I think we need to spend more time, like Doug said, creating a marketplace. So giving parents the information they need to be able to make these decisions. I kind of look at this like, if you think of the Department of Health, the Department of Health ranks every single restaurant. If there was no market mechanism for restaurants, that would probably be a much bigger tool that we would be using to figure out which restaurants to go to. But when you're here in DC visiting, you're probably going to go on Yelp. You're probably going to go on Urban Spoon to find what restaurant you're going to go to. Now, the Department of Health is probably going to be very integrated with how well that business is doing, but because there's a marketplace, we're crowdsourcing the information we need. So things like Great Schools and other apps like that can really be used and really marketed to parents to help them understand how the schools are and why they need to make the smart decisions. To me, that's a much better use of resources than shutting down schools with a lot of nuance inside of it.
So I think that this is, I think we all agree that there's an immature market that is still being developed to provide consumers with the information they need to make great choices. There are a lot of things that work, obviously, long before publicly funded private school choice, people were making decisions about where to send their children to school. A lot of that was based upon word of mouth and what you heard from other people, not based upon scores. In some communities, you're not going to get a lot of word of mouth about what those options are that are available out there. So that's problematic. There's not enough publicly available information for people in some cases to make those choices. And more needs to be clearly done in that area. But here's the political rub. So what you're saying to public officials is, okay, we're going to build this market over time, and eventually it's all going to be working, perfect. It's going to be great. It's just going to be like the marketplace for mutual funds, where everyone has all sorts of information about it. They pick the investment that makes the most sense for them. It's going to be great, but we're not there yet. So in the meantime, keep funding this program, knowing that in some cases you are funding failure. And that is a difficult place for politicians to be. It is a difficult place for the movement here to be as well, because we get haunted by the small number of bad stories. I mean, it used to drive me nuts in Milwaukee every year. We had over 100 schools in the Milwaukee program, and each year a couple of schools would fail. That would be major news.
Right.
The fact that 100 schools were succeeding and doing well was not news.
Right.
And that drives the political conversation that occurs out there. It's hard to ask public officials to say there's an acceptable level of failure here,
Right.
even though that's what they're doing in the public schools. But there it's a different debate. So it's a very difficult thing, and that's why I think you're beginning to see these efforts by public officials to do something beyond marketplace consequences and rewards. It also, I think, has something to do as we're changing the whole philosophy here. I mean, we have moved from a system where we were funding schools to now we're trying to fund children, right? We're trying to make an investment in each kid's future. So there's some natural sense, I think, from politicians to say, so how do I ensure that that's a good investment?
Right.
And, most of us say trust the parents, but that's a hard thing to ask public officials to do. So we're trying to find answers that don't take away autonomy, that aren't too burdensome for the schools. In most cases, they rely on transparency, but we're struggling in some cases.
No, so Scott, I think that's a fantastic point. And given that this is billed as a strategy session, this is a great opportunity to talk about that, because it seems like, throughout your answers, there was this sort of, there's the ideal, and then there is what is politically possible.
Yeah.
So the ideal
20
might
years
be.
in public office.
Yeah.
He's a former Speaker of the House.
That's what I figured. Well, I was about to kick this all back
I
to.
get 50 votes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I was about to kick this back to all of you with your experiences. I work in Washington and just bloviate for a living. So you all actually do this
There's
stuff
a whole
every day.
marketplace for that here.
I know. It's awesome. No, so anyway, I guess, so the point, the question that I have for you all is that sort of strategy session. We have lots of state legislators in the room. We have folks that work in these advocacy organizations about that sort of negotiation. So clearly there is, if the ideal that was put up here is let's get information, let's have light touch, let's not stifle things, and then perhaps on the other side is let's regulate this thing to death and choke it. Obviously, you have to come somewhere in the middle in our current political context. So how might people here help sort of negotiate that, to be guardians of autonomy or to try and push back against those? Are there particular ways that you have found, working in the states that you are, to be sort of effective messengers for autonomy and lighter touch regulation?
The back and forth that Scott and I just sort of had with Adam, I think is exactly how the process has to work. I mean, I think compromise works best when you're transparent and you're open about the challenges that you're facing. And yeah, there is a gap between the ideal and the real world at times, and that's where compromise has to be found. I think, like I said, I'm really concerned about, in making those political compromises the way Scott just described. Like I said, in low-income communities, particularly low-income communities of color, there is a dearth of quality options. And like I said before, sometimes shutting down a low-performing option leaves the families with even worse options. And so that's why I'm nervous about these policies out of the state that aren't really sensitive to what happens in some of these communities. So we've got to have a nuanced policy. I guess the more transparent you are about those issues and more open and honest you are about the discussion increases the probability that you get those nuances worked out.
I'll say something that might be controversial, but it shouldn't be. Testing isn't accountability. Testing is the tool you use to generate the information, and then what you do with that information, and who's responsible for that information, and what you use with it. That's where the accountability comes in. So I am less worried about private schools and kind of, the impression that, some parents might not make the best choices, because they're the ones that are ultimately accountable. And also, the accountability that's happening in the public schools isn't necessarily accountability. I mean, we have testing in every state, but I would be hard-pressed to say that every state holds their schools accountable. So there's a woman in Arizona named Kathy Visser. I don't know if she's in here. But her son uses the Education Savings Account program there. And her son is disabled. He had a hard time in public schools. She tried to get him placed in another public school. It didn't work. She tried to sue them, found it was going to be a $15,000 retainer. Said, okay. Found out about this program from the lawyer she was trying to get to sue the public schools. Put her child in a private school that actually didn't work out for her. So now she's using an ESA program. She's homeschooling her child for some of the day. She's doing private courses for some of the day. She's using physical therapy and other things to improve his education. But she says that every single provider that she works with is accountable to her. Now, that's not anything that she would even remotely get close to in the public schools. So is that ideal? Is every parent a Kathy Visser? No. But I would be much more comfortable sleeping at night knowing that she's making the decisions than someone is from above.
I think that I think the presentation was called Getting the Right Mix here, and that's really what the challenge is. And if states under-regulate at a time in which a market is just emerging, you're going to get bad stories, and you can get a political reaction to that. You're not going to necessarily have, right now, in a lot of states that I see here represented by legislators in the room, we have wonderful, enlightened leadership, right? But that may not be the case after the next election. You might have a different group of people who are in charge who then will respond to the stories they heard in the past. Politicians regulate the past. They do not regulate the present. And unfortunately, they shape the future. But they regulate the past. So like generals who fight the last battle, who prepare for the last battle, that's what politicians do. They regulate the problem that occurred last year, not what's happening right now. And so if we don't have a base level you're going to get the sort of stories that result in really bad regulation when a different and less enlightened group of people are in trouble. So we've got to get to a basic law. And I think everybody here is pretty comfortable with the administrative and the financial accountability regulation. It is the academic area where we're all trying to struggle that we don't want to interfere with the autonomy of the schools, the innovation that we see in different models, and yet we feel some need to know, is it working? I mean, that's a legitimate thing for public officials to say, okay, in my home state, last year, I think we spent $180 million on this program. Next year, it's going to be close to $250 million. That's a lot of money. I think it's fairly reasonable for politicians to want to be able to say, is it working?
Just for everybody to know, when Scott says unenlightened, he means Democrats, just so you know.
Not necessarily.
Great. So I think I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to turn it over to the folks in the room. So I see we already have some eager people, which is outstanding. There are 2 microphones right here, so if you're interested in asking a question, that's, I think, what you should take advantage of. So my last question, Scott, and this was a great segue to it, is looking forward, as Doug was talking about education savings accounts and this idea of sort of rethinking the school model. Those of you up on the stage had to sort of build the plane as you flew it, with voucher programs, with tax credit programs, trying to figure out how to make this work in both a political and a practical sense. So we have this sort of shared set of knowledge of, we've done this like twice before, gone through pitfalls and others. What sort of lessons or wisdom might you have as people start thinking about how to make these sort of education savings accounts, and particularly like what sort of regulations they might be looking to do? What sort of lessons might we have on the front end, things to avoid, pitfalls, et cetera?
I think you want to focus on financial accountability at the start and transparency, and go slowly on any academic accountability in a new program like this. Because for those who aren't familiar with the education savings account idea, I mean, parents get money from the state put in a bank account, and they get to spend it however they think it is appropriate for their child's education. That's wonderful. And in Arizona, the first state to really pioneer this, we expected that families were going to get a debit card, and they were going to be able to, swipe it at different places and order the things that they want to order. But what we found was that you can't get a debit card till you have 4,000 people. That's the technological threshold before you can get the equivalent of the card you have for food stamps or food share or whatever we call it these days. You need to have a base of 4,000 people. We don't have that many people. So what they gave them instead was the equivalent of gift cards. A gift card that you can spend anywhere you want to spend. And we've had some parents spend it inappropriately. So there's a problem. So if 97% of the parents are spending this and having wonderful stories about the transformation it has had in their kids, and 3% are playing with the system, that's a problem. So there has to be a base level of regulation here, so that we can have the regulations sort of develop over time in a way that respects autonomy and innovation.
The other thing that's interesting to me is because there's been historically little choice in public education, we haven't developed the infrastructure to help people make good choices. I mean, Scott mentioned earlier the financial area, or most of us have a primary health care physician that helps us navigate health care, but we've never built that support system in education. And so now we're having to build that on the fly too. So I think, Mike, at the end of the day, really what's going to be critical is we start to get caught up in building this infrastructure so that every parent has a trusted advisor who is objective, not the high school guidance counselor, but an independent, trusted advisor that's going to help them figure out just not the academic choices, but also the social, emotional, which is, as Adam said, we're getting much more appreciative of the role of emotional intelligence and how do we help kids, deal with that. So I think building, the work that Bill Jackson's doing, at great schools and his colleagues, and there's other folks doing work, we've got to build out this infrastructure that helps people make really good choices. And that's going to be critical to help parents begin to spend down the money that Scott mentioned in a highly effective way.
Great. So I think we can turn it over to the audience. If you could do me a favor, when you ask your question, just introduce yourself. We're all friends here. So introduce yourself and then ask away. I think we'll start here and we can kind of bounce around.
Thank you. Lee Denny from State of Oklahoma, House member. When you talk about the academic mix, the academic portion of the voucher program, and you don't want overreach from state or federal, and yet you want accountability, my question is, will they be testing all the students, or will they cherry pick? Because we will get crucified for this in our state. Will they cherry pick who they test? And if they do that, or if they're failing and we don't do something about it, how can we say it's a better choice for our students? Because this is a huge fight in Oklahoma.
Well, in Florida, by law, if you want to keep your scholarship, you have to take the test. So if a school's cherry picking and not allowing some children to take the test, those kids will lose their scholarship, and we also can pull that school out of the program. So at least in Florida, that's not an option.
Okay.
In general, around the country, in the general education school choice programs, all of the publicly funded students or students through scholarship tax credit programs have to take the test. No one else in the school does, right, which sometimes causes problems as well. But only the kids who are receiving the benefit of one of those programs has to take the test. In special needs programs, in most cases, they are not required under special needs scholarship programs to take the state or any test.
Wonderful. Over on our left here.
Jim Bender from School of Choice, Wisconsin. Scott and I spend a great deal of time together. One of the things that we are dealing with in Wisconsin is meshing the political reality with the academic accountability with confidence in the statewide report card. Currently, if you take the statewide report card scores and overlay it with a poverty map in Wisconsin, it's the same thing.
Right.
It is literally the same thing. We have 1 million kids in schools, 80,000 of them are in the city of Milwaukee, yet 95% of the quote-unquote failing schools are within 11 miles of each other, all in the city of Milwaukee. That's an impossibility. I mean, that tells you what the demographics of your school are. It has no indication at all the impact of the school on there. My question is this: when we're talking about what level of accountability or potential sanctions, how much of that is due to the confidence or lack thereof of the measuring stick that we're using to say you're out? Because on a simple math calculation, if you take higher growth in a poverty school, all of a sudden that school meets a criteria. You turn the dial 2 clicks the other way, oops, sorry, you're out. That's one of the things we're struggling with, which gets away from the should we have sanctions or not, but what's the measuring stick we're using?
Sure.
I mean, I can speak to the school grading component. I need to learn more about how you guys do it. Christy Hovanes here is our school grading expert. She can probably help you. But yeah, definitely a mix of growth and proficiency. I mean, the school that I mentioned, or the program I mentioned earlier, they only look at proficiency. So clearly these schools are going to look bad, so it's hard for me to trust what they're going to be, if they're actually making gains with these students. I think that Doug can talk about this a little bit more, but I mean, you can show learning gains through national norm reference tests. I mean, and that's key, is that putting a spotlight on the growth to proficiency. So we want to make sure these kids are learning a year's worth of knowledge, a year's worth of time. If they're doing more than that, great, we should reward that and we should acknowledge that. I don't know, I mean, in your state you're talking about where they're taking the state test. That's a whole different animal. That's a whole different thing to do. And then the problem is that you have interests that are both trying to defeat that test and then trying to impose it incorrectly onto private schools. So you need to find ways that not only help you now, but think of regulations as what happens if, Armageddon, worst case scenario happens, the worst possible person in the future comes and takes over this oversight of this program, whether it's a superintendent or something. Can they use the regulations that are in place to do something about those schools that are, could destroy them?
Governor Bush and I have never had this conversation, but I'm going to say that I read his mind on this one. I'm convinced that one of the things he wanted to do was to put a lot of pressure on local school boards in Florida to force them to put more attention on schools serving large numbers of high poverty kids. And while the first several years of grading did the same thing in Florida that you described, in Wisconsin, which is high correlation between SES, I think Jeb was good with that. I mean, because low-income families aren't writing $500 checks to school boards, and so you look at the allocation of resources, including the best teachers. Low-income kids were getting thrown under the bus, and so I think part of what the grading system does is designed to, frankly, coerce school districts to look over the local politics and do the right thing for kids by putting resources in the places where kids need them. And so I appreciate we got to do value added and gain scores, et cetera, to try to be as accurate as possible. Frankly, I don't mind the fact that we're embarrassing school districts by having high F schools in high poverty communities, because I want them to get off their posteriors and invest in those kids.
Great. So I've noticed, since we're all friends, and friends have to be honest with one another, we have about 10 minutes left in this session, and it looks like we have about 8 people who'd like to talk. So if possible, I'd like to kind of maybe move to a speed round. So what I'm going to encourage, and we're going to try a little experiment here, if perhaps each side will ask 2 questions at once. So we'll have 1 question here, 1 question here, and I'm going to encourage my panelists, maybe just 1 panelist take the question, so we can keep it moving here. So if we could have a question here, and then we'll keep it moving. So ma'am.
Hi, Susan Myers with the Freeman Foundation for Educational Choice. Good to see you guys. When I hear accountability, I know when I hear it in the Obama administration, it's usually code word for regulation on the private sector. This seems to be a public relations problem. Do we need to do a better job of doing more public relations and education of lawmakers so they don't feel that they need to run to the corner and regulate school choice programs more? And when we see government schools, that seems to be regulation. When we see the private sector, that seems to be a free market. I don't know any sense of there being a little bit pregnant and a little bit of a free market. So my question to you is, do we need to do a better job of having more outreach to lawmakers? And when we say school choice, we always say that we believe in parents and they are smart enough to make good decisions. So do we believe in the private sector that they're smart enough to make good decisions when it comes to picking the best school for their child?
Okay, wonderful. That will be question number 1. Go ahead and think. And question number 2.
Hey, Doug, I'm one of those unenlightened. Quentin Ross, state senator from Alabama.
Me too, by the way.
Yeah.
Lifelong Democrat here, too.
But my question is, and we've talked about it a little bit, in terms of identifying, we say, okay, well, we know public schools are failing. And then you give the choice, and you say, well, you can go to a private school. And we talk about we don't want to test. How do we know and guarantee that you don't go from a public school to a failing private school? And I heard you mention about closing the charter. I think that's the, overarching argument about giving school choice, because they can go from one failing situation to another, but you have a way to identify in public schools because it's been around forever, but you really don't have a way to identify in, those choice schools. The other question would be that in an area where you're a rural community and you have no school choice, right, you just have your failing school, what do you do to accomplish the goal of the scholarship programs to help those students who are considered to be in a failing school?
All right, wonderful. 2 outstanding questions. Thank you very much. So maybe we'll start with the PR question.
Well, I guess I took the question not necessarily to be, I know you mentioned public relations, but I trust the parents to make good decisions. And in fact, in a marketplace, you don't have to trust all of the consumers to make good decisions, right? Because the marketplace itself responds to those people who have the most information and who know the most about a particular purchasing decision. So I know nothing about cars, but I look around to see what other people are driving in my neighborhood, right? That's how I made my decision about what car to get. Sorry. When it came to schooling, we took a lot more time and a lot more information in our house. So I think the key is I trust the parents, but we're not giving them all the information that they need and should have in order to make good decisions. And that's something that we in the school choice movement need to continue to push on. In the rural areas, it's a huge problem. We hear it all the time. I'm hoping that technology helps us solve some of that, and people will get to a position like with an ESA where they might go to their local public school for some of the day, and then they are buying other classes online to supplement because their local high school doesn't have a physics program, or they don't teach Mandarin, or they don't have something else that the parent really wants. They can go to the public school for part of the day, and then they can use their ESA to buy whatever else they need online. So I think that's one answer for me.
I'll go quick. In Florida, we do require every child on our program to be tested. So even if they go to a small school. The other thing that's interesting about rural areas, it's harder for charter schools to get into rural areas, but a lot of rural areas have small faith-based schools. And so about 80% of the kids in our program attend a faith-based school, and a lot of them are in rural areas. So I think you'll find in rural Alabama that there are faith-based schools that are available to families.
Great. It looks like we may have time for 2 more, so I think we'll try this same thing again, noting that we have about 4 or 5 minutes to both ask and answer questions. Okay. Yes, sir.
Chris Nordstrom, I'm on the central staff at the North Carolina General Assembly. Interested in the question of state versus nationally normed tests. And one of the advantages of a state test is that the infrastructure is generally there to allow growth measures. So I was wondering if you guys could talk about whether or not there are any examples of states that use nationally normed tests and provide growth measures for each school that accepts voucher students, and what sort of infrastructure investments were required to get that in place?
Awesome. That will be a great question. Yes, sir.
Thank you. David Harvin, School Administrator for Mount Bethel Christian Academy. One thing I've noticed is that when we're looking at data, we're always looking at grades 3 and up. And I found out that when kids can read in kindergarten, they can read also in 3rd grade. So I'm wondering, and I've been in education for about 21 years, we test kids in kindergarten, but the data that is requested is only for grades 3 and up. I want to understand that the rationale for only requesting data for those in grades 3 and up, and if there isn't any true rationale, why not require data for students who are in kindergarten as well?
Outstanding. So maybe we can start with the state versus norm reference, and we'll talk about earlier grades second.
Yeah, let me jump on that real quick. If you go to the Florida DOE website, look up the David Figlio reports on the Florida Task Credit Scholarship Program. We use a nationally normed standardized test, and he generates growth data every year on our
For
report.
each school, though, or for aggregate across the state? I thought it was aggregate.
It's for every school that has 30 or more testable kids, he also generates data for those schools. We use 30 or more because the NLCB standards. But you'll see that in the most recent last 2 figure reports have school-based data for 30 or more testable kids.
On the K through 3 reading issue, that's a public school thing and a private school thing. I mean, the reason it's 3 through 8 is basically because federal guidelines are essentially saying that. So that's why you see a lot of states have that. But we agree completely, both public and private schools. I mean, we're not going to impose it on private schools, but they should be, monitoring students in kindergarten to see if they have any literacy concerns, because the statistics are overwhelming that if you can't read by the end of 3rd grade, you're going to have real problems going on in life. So yeah, we completely support. I think we probably have a session on that too at some point in the summit, talking about identifying early struggling readers and then putting supports in place that help them learn to read for those next 3 years. So I agree completely.
All right, wonderful. People are keeping to time. This is great. I think we can take 2. There are 2 people left in the microphones. 2 quick questions.
Very quickly. Steve Cookson, I'm Chairman of Education in the Missouri House of Representatives in Missouri. Exactly, I heard it mentioned just a second ago, faith-sponsored private school choice. How does that fit into all? That's part of the school choice options that we're all talking about?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I'll answer that since you.
Boom. Super helpful. Great.
And
Kara.
mine's a yes/no question. Kara Kerwin from the Center for Education Reform. Doug, you could probably answer this quickly. In
Yes.
Louisiana, in Louisiana, only about 1/3 of the private schools are participating, and as we did some more research, it's because the cost of the regulation and of the state test. Do you think if that were imposed on the schools in Florida, would your pool of schools, would you lose some of the quality providers that your students have access to?
Yes. And
Boom. Love it.
Real quickly on the faith-based question. The U.S. Supreme Court has said in 2006 Zellman decision out of Ohio, as long as the money goes to the family and the family makes the choice, it's a constitutional option. It's basically freedom of religion. If the government were to fund the schools directly, that could get into an establishment clause issue. But in Florida, for example, in most of the other states, we give the money to the families, and the families make that choice, and that allows it to be constitutional as it relates to church-state issues.
And thank you for trying to give kids private school choice in the last session there in Missouri. Unfortunately, your governor vetoed it as part of the grand compromise or non-compromise in education. But keep fighting. Keep fighting. Thank you.
Outstanding. Well, if we could give a round of applause to the folks up here. Thank you so much. Have a great day.